the last one we were talking about before the break. Okay, here we go. You can actually download a copy of this book at the 55minutes.ca or .com, .net, .org. They'll all work. Really, it's an atlas. We designed this as an atlas to navigate problems, reveal systems, and ask beautiful questions in what we think is a radically shifting world. It's a 20 chapter resource for practitioners mainly, but a really broad swath of practitioners working in really any sector. Um, as long as you're interested in using a kind of systems tools or systems concepts, systems framework approach to tackle difficult problems. The title, of course, takes its inspiration from an Albert Einstein quote. If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about solutions. And our thesis, our argument is that we actually live in a dominant kind of, if you're thinking of Western contemporary society, our dominant cultural context is actually a society that is only dedicated to that last 5 minutes or mainly dedicated. It's a solutions society, if you like. But because, most of us live in contexts where there's incentives built into our own systems to dwell in that last 5 minutes, whether that's in governments working to election cycles, whether that's in solutions-driven companies. I mean, that's the number one descriptor of tech companies, or in fact, even in our educational journey, where we're placing value on binary answers to questions, and that there's a right answer that only if we sort of commit ourselves to understanding that right answer and then memorizing that right answer and being tested on that right answer, we'll somehow learn. And we think that in the process, we have actually abandoned that first 55 minutes. The opening poll question is a really interesting one, right? Because it asks, what's your own self-assessed level of knowledge around systems thinking? And it's an interesting question because we maintain in the book that systems thinking is actually a natural way for humans to think and to approach problem solving. But that we actually, in the contemporary West over the last few hundred years, and especially over the 20th and 21st centuries, we have moved towards a culture that doesn't value that as much. And so there are some parts of academia that have kind of rediscovered systems, ways of working and thinking and so on. And if you look at, amazing polymath academics like Jay Forrester and Donella Meadows and Russell Ackoff and Peter Senge and so on, they're all amazing minds with great insight. But it is not to say that systems thinking is new or even decades old. It is centuries, if not millennia old. And it is, we maintain, the way of thinking that most cultures through most of human history have adopted. It's emphatically common sense. And so it's a strange thing then to kind of go back to that rediscovery and try and unveil it with a kind of patina of academic um, rigor. And so that's kind of where we are. I'm immensely grateful to two organizations that produce this. So I'll talk about in a moment. But yeah, that's kind of the premise of the book. So Sylvia, I guess I don't know if that kind of addresses your question, but that's kind of the backstory.
It absolutely does. And I think for me, what caught me, because I've loved the book actually, is why you focused on it and what your hope is now that we've
Mhm.
grabbed the atlas. Because I do think it has done such a nice job of kind of giving me 110 different ways to build that non-binary, non-mechanical thinking muscle, um, which is at the foundation of systems. So tell us, what's the hope? What do you want folks to take away when they look at the book and
Well,
use
first
them.
of all, I really want to acknowledge the two. I mean, this book wouldn't have been produced without two producing partners that are radically different from one another. One is Atco Limited, a publicly traded company based in Alberta, but with a global reach, about 21,000 employees. And the other is the Institute for Community Prosperity, which I formerly worked at, which sits at the nexus between academia and social impact. Now, at first glance, wow, you couldn't pick two different organizations to partner together, but actually they share a common observation that the way we approach problems is wholly inadequate. That one of the most important missing ingredients in innovation of any kind, so whether that's commercial innovation, public policy innovation, social innovation, is a failure to think systemically, a failure to acknowledge and embrace complexity. Ultimately, a failure to spend that time, that 55 minutes, meaningfully trying to understand problems that we're enmeshed in. So anyone who sees or experiences a problem in the world at any scale, whether that's their family, their company, their organization, in the economy at large or society at large, or in an ecosystem, or on the planet as a whole, and who has some desire to change that status quo, must by default be interested in systems change. And that is because virtually everything is a system. And so, every system has three components: elements, sometimes called nodes or parts. That's the stuff, the nouns in a system. It has interconnections or relationships or interactions, but some connective tissue between the two, or connective energy, if you like. And third is the results that emerge from those connections, um, is a purpose, is a function, is some kind of emergent property that didn't exist with just the parts themselves, right? So Aristotle's maxim that the sum is greater than the parts, it really is true when you're talking about systems. And systems are virtually everywhere, right? So things as simple as water or rocks are actually systems. We are systems. Our brains are systems. Our organizations, our industries, our governments, our cultures, they're all systems. So if you're not interested in systems change, then you're just not interested in change. So this slide outlines some features of systems that we do spend some time in the book exploring. I won't belabor them in any detail here, but we do provide examples from both the natural world and from human or social systems, which, by the way, include systems of commerce, enterprise, and finance. We do not believe that the social is confined to acts of intentional benevolence. We do not believe that the social is over here and the economy is over here. That it's all connected, right? A problem is a problem is a problem. Now, naturally, there are differences in how complex these various challenges are. Um, the number and complexity of systems that are implicated in wanting to make change, but really for the big kinds of hairy, difficult social challenges that I'm sure everyone on this call are passionate about, the concept of change is actually kind of fraught. You might have conservationists on the call who are interested in sustainability, for example. So they may actually see their role as trying to defend what is working about the status quo, what is working about the current system, or what could be optimized about the current system, in the face of, say, radical proposals to do elsewise. And so we're really circumspect about this word change in the book. It's not a book about systems change. It really is fundamentally a book about better understanding the system. It's about contextual understanding, which we believe is necessary as a precondition for durable and broadly useful change. But again, not all change is good. Our hope is that this book is widely used by as many diverse users as possible, and that it's helping people to, in a sense, slow down and think more deeply about the context in which they're eager to affect change.
That's
Crisis management experts Ken Aspelin, David Mitroff, um, uh, whose writing is fantastic on risk and systematizing how we think about risk. They note that our society is really, really good at solving the wrong problems precisely. And we're saying, well, we need to be interested to ask better questions of the right problems, which also means that we have to let go of solving and the obsession with solving, which is a difficult thing to do. It sounds almost irresponsible.
Oh, I think it's really profound. Can you give us a quick overview of the atlas, how you've laid out the 55 minutes and how
Sure.
you're thinking folks can use them? How do you work with this resource that you've given us?
Yeah, so we actually start with a navigation chapter with that really is a way we'd call the starting point query. And it's actually a series of questions that we just ask readers to help you get the most out of the book. There's certain sections that you could probably just skip ahead and dive into if you are, you have a range of people who have different comfort levels around systems thinking or where they do they consider themselves advanced around this or experts even? I think for a lot of those folks, you can skip over some of the first few chapters that are a little more foundational. Um, and so, the book is generally divided into two main sections. Foundations is that kind of understanding the basics. What is a system? What is systems practice? What are problems? That's a really interesting one to interrogate. What really is a problem? We talk a little bit about complexity. There are great books out there on complexity and embracing complexity. We kind of survey some of that and provide some overview concepts. But we really stress this idea that you need to hang up your solution. You need to avoid letting the solution guide you. And you need to, as best as possible, strip away your biases around being attracted to a particular shiny thing, no matter how compelling it is. It could be a policy idea. It could be your venture that you've created. It could be a new program or approach that's worked in like Finland or somewhere else that's just shown exceptional results that you want to just import. But before you do that, you need to make sure you really understand the context. We provide some foundational discussion about how to research and so on, what mapping is all about. Do you need to map? Um, and then the second section of the book is really a series of chapters. You'll notice there's 11 increments totaling 55 minutes, and each of those 11 increments has a label, a chapter label, and it actually has a convening question attached to it too. So there is actually a final 5 minutes that is the third piece of the book, but this is not a guide as to how to act. It's a guide to think about when you get into the action phase, have you actually done enough systems understanding? Do you need to reframe your problem? Do you need to think about your own positionality and your own place in that system and so on? So it's not a guide to acting. I need to stress that. So in each of these chapters, we start with a convening question. And then what follows is a set of tools. There are 30 tools in total. Most of these tools, the vast majority, are not our tools. They are tools that will be familiar to many. They come from a variety of fields as diverse as anthropology or theology or military studies or urban planning and so on and so forth, management science. But we've brought them together under this banner because we think they are unique ways or unique means of interrogating these questions. So we start with where do we focus and where do we set the boundaries? That's the frame. If you're taking a picture, Ansel Adams says you don't take a picture, you make a picture. And that is just as true when you're looking at a system. There's no universally agreed upon healthcare system or education system. You have to set those boundaries and they have to make some sense to you and to others. But framing is important. And landscape. So what's in the frame? Like, what does it actually look like at a very broad level? What are the contours of the current system? So we have some very broad tools for diving into that. And that helps you really organize your research. It helps you figure out who you need to talk to. Roots, what's beneath the surface? So, people on this call are probably familiar with tools like the 5 Whys or the iceberg diagram or the 6 conditions of systems change. Those are some of the tools we employ in the roots section. Origins, how did we get here? So this is a temporal one. This isn't just what's beneath the surface, but how did this come to be a problem in the first place? So it's looking back on history. And then equally, we need to look forward or project into the future, not to be predictive, but to both imagine new futures and have guide stars that are in front of us, so that we can contrast the current system with what we might imagine to be ideal. But also, what happens if we do nothing? What does the future inevitably look like based on our best information? Experience. How is the system experienced by those within it? So this is where we get into the user perspective, the perspective of people who are typically the intended beneficiaries or supposed beneficiaries of a system. How are they actually benefiting and experiencing the system? So there's a variety of tools, from ethnography to journey mapping and so on. Relationships. So this is what you see quite often when you Google systems map. It'll show you like a spaghetti diagram of a bunch of organizations or entities and how they're connected. And that is a piece of it, but it's far from everything. But understanding the nature of those relationships is really important, and that helps you. That's kind of an opening act to determining what really matters, which is power. Who and what holds influence? How is it wielded? What are the instruments of power? Who has power to change? Who can be an ally? And so on and so forth. Causality, this is the logic in a system. What causes what to do what? So here we have what would be much more familiar to, say, system scientists. People who teach systems thinking in universities would focus a lot on causality. This is a large chapter because it does require a fair deal of technical explanation. Narrative, this is about the stories, the thinking, the mental models that keep problems in place. This is emphatically not about data or about measurable things, but about the stories we tell to ourselves that are often so buried. They're really difficult to surface because they're just like the water we're swimming in if we were fish. And then finally, leverage. Where in the system might change be possible? Here, of course, we talk about Donella Meadows' concept of leverage points, but we also talk about things like theory of change. This is the kind of opening act to getting ready to act. How do we actually think about uh, applying any kind of acupressure to the system, or how do we garden the system in a way that might produce better outcomes? And again, as I say, we have this kind of last chapter about acting, but we really place more emphasis on using that time to reframe as necessary. You will be reframing the whole time. You might start off with one question that you're investigating, but with each new input, you may actually alter the frame a little bit and restate your question. And that's what we sort of mean about beautiful questions. We're trying to get to a better question with each means of deepening our understanding of the system. We
Well,
have
that
perfunctory
feels.
sections on each of these in the acting section, but like I say, it's not a guide to acting.
I thank you for that. I'm kind of watching the time, and if you can maybe touch a little bit around the importance of self-awareness as you work to engage this system, that would be beautiful.
Yeah, so we do, I mean, in the foundation section, we have a whole series of sections that are collectively titled Systems Practice. So for each of these, we actually dive into uh, some storytelling about, like, what do we mean by this? What are some examples from the real world? And how might you think about incorporating this in your own thinking and acting? So one of the critiques we sometimes hear around systems thinking is that, like, it strikes people as analysis paralysis. It's overly incremental, it's overly cautious, it's even to some unambitious. But I would simply ask, what are we masking or hiding from or running from when we rush so quickly to action? A systems-led approach actually requires more audacious thinking than might appear at the surface, right? It requires asking a relentless questioning process about everything. The assumptions you hold about the system. What is a fact? Do facts move people? If not facts, then what about stories? Well, what stories? What moves people? What do people question? what would an alien think about this system if they were to land on Earth and make some casual observations? There's things that we take for granted that would be utterly absurd. And so, and or not just absurd, I mean, in some cases, utterly cruel or deeply unfair. And so those are the kinds of things that we want you to interrogate, and which is not an incremental act. It is not a gradual act. It is a profound act. Um, and so part of that is like, how do you think about your own self system? You're a system yourself. And even if you think you are just sort of objectively or dispassionately observing a system from outside, you're not. The observer is making the wave function collapse. You are enmeshed. You are implicated in some way, even if you think you aren't. And so we do interrogate that. I won't go into this in much detail, but we try and take people through, like, there are different pathways to understanding. We're really comfortable with a kind of epistemological understanding of the world, right? This is where, objective learning. This is logic, this is data, this is sort of, peer-reviewed journals and so on. This is great, and we're really good at this, and universities are really good at this. But it's not enough. We know it's not enough. You can't engage with the system from a purely objective standpoint. You engage with the system with a set of values, and those values inform the nature of your engagement and what your takeaways are, and why you even focused on that system in the first place, why you're even spending an ounce of energy on that, right? That's based on your values. And what about experience, right? If it's not your own experience, then what are you doing to ensure that other people's experience counts and is part of your discovery of what the system is about? And so many contemporary issues take years and years for peer-reviewed academic literature to appear. And so if it's a really contemporary issue, you're relying heavily on firsthand experience as much as possible. And then, of course, you also have to have this kind of intellectual humility to say, well, even with all these other inputs, um, we will never actually know the system as it truly is. It's really what we might call a vector, not a destination, right? It's a journey. So if you're wanting to discover what a system is really like, you honestly and earnestly approach some degree of objective understanding, but you will never objectively understand the system. So there's a paradox there. Um, and this is a wonderful quote from a philosopher, Mary Midgley, who has this kind of observation that, we're always looking for data. We're always looking for information. Just give us more data. With more data, we'll make better decisions. And well, maybe, but information itself, she reminds us, actually has no value. It only begins to have value when we imbue it with value. When we think, oh, that's useful to us, when it's brought in contact with some existing system or purpose, and helps us fill a gap. So that is all a subjective and axiological pursuit, right? Our beliefs, our attitudes, what we think is right or wrong or beautiful or ugly, all those things play into our journey. And so what we did is to structure the entire 55-minute journey. We said, well, actually, the 55 minutes itself is this kind of quest for greater objective understanding, but it's sandwiched between the subjective starting point, which is, well, what do I even care about? And the subjective, in a sense, end point, although there really is never an end point, but the last 5 minutes of, so, okay, so now I have all this information and I'm really passionate about this. What do I actually have time and energy and passion to work on? And so it's a subjective to objective to subjective journey.
I love this visual. I think it's perfect. And I'm watching the clock here because I know we've got some good
Yep.
questions already brewing in the chat box. So my last sort of question for you, maybe to speak to, and a reminder for you all, if you're thinking it through and have not yet put your question in, is my last question for you would be, what for you, in your experience, are the characteristics of a beautiful question? What do you
Yeah, it's a great, it's a really interesting thing. We use this term "beautiful question." We struggle with it a lot. We were for until the very last minute, we actually had the term "better question." Search for, but we're like, let's just let's just rip off the Band-Aid. Beautiful sounds more beautiful. So, this is an example of a beautiful question. So, one of the I just have to back up for a second. One of the origin stories of the 55 minutes is that the same three authors, myself, Anna Johnson, Daniela Pappy Thornton, we back in 2019 wrote a student guide to mapping a system. Now, this was very specifically to support students in a particular global challenge hosted by the University of Oxford, and it was created originally by Daniela. And this particular question comes from one of the competing teams this year. It was a team of students from the American University in Cairo, as they learned about and attempted to map, quote unquote, a system that criminalizes debt. It disproportionately affects widowed mothers, over 30,000 of whom are in Egyptian prisons at any given time. So this is in Egypt a phenomenon known as garamat. And in this case, we think it's a beautiful question of an ugly issue because it has an emotional impact. It makes you sit up and lean in, but more importantly, because it lays it naked. It doesn't sanitize or whitewash or dress up with euphemisms. You know, you could ask, well, how might we reduce the incidence of Garamet among newly single females? That's not a wrong question. It's just a bit of a dully bureaucratic question. It's banal. Beautiful questions tend to dig beneath the surface, shine the light on something more essential, more the essence of something. And often that's unexpected. So they tend to, by virtue of that, they tend to not only expose but unsettle and make people honestly a little bit uncomfortable. And that's the sign you're onto a
that's
better question, right?
That's a beautiful, beautiful synthesis. I am so keen and eager. We've got some really great questions in the chat. And if you have one brewing and you haven't yet put it into the Q&A box, I urge you to do that. Um, but Mairead, what are we seeing here? What are some of the questions that are popping in?
Absolutely. The first question actually comes to us from the chat, and it's from Lana, who asks, so this book is very linear in that it has chapters in a certain order. To what extent should we be following the chapters in that order, or is there a way that you can
Hmm.
swap or move different pieces around as you see fit?
Yeah, fantastic. And we self-knowingly include a little disclaimer at the very beginning saying, yeah, sorry about that. We decided to write a book, which is inherently a linear technology. Probably not the best medium to describe something that's nonlinear. So for that reason, that's actually why we leaned into this term, an atlas, rather than a guide or a toolkit or something like that. And because an atlas, you never read cover to cover. I mean, most people don't. You just open it up to what's interesting or where you need the information. And we really do want this to be treated in the same way. You're welcome to read it from cover to cover, but we fully expect that most people won't. You know, you're gonna skip over sections, certainly tools that you're like, yeah, I know that tool. I'm going to skip over that. Or yeah, I get the rationale for doing this. I just want some of the meaty practical pieces. You know, you might be a facilitator that wants to dive into the tools right away, or you might be more of a more philosophical and spend more time on the beginning of the book and not be that interested in the practical tools. So people use the book in different ways. When you get to the tools section, and again, we use a linear analog clock, but again, you don't, it made somewhat logical sense for us to order it that way. But honestly, we've had it organized in many, many different ways and many, many different versions. So again, start anywhere, start at, 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock. Don't start at midnight.
Great. Okay. And I actually wanted to jump to another question that is not necessarily asked next, but is very relevant, which is Becky's question in the Q&A box. Becky's asking, if you wanted to do a full day workshop on this with a group of people, could it be broken down by subject area? For example, could a community group dedicated to housing solutions come together and break into small groups to each tackle one section of the book and then come together with their learnings at the end?
Yes, absolutely. I just spent a half day workshop online with a group of MBA students at Cape Breton University, and they all are studying community economic development and organizational behavior. And so, I made sure that we didn't have too many examples that were not germane to that specific area. So we have examples in the book from many different domains, but we also have like a whole arsenal of backup examples that can be applied to issues like housing or healthcare, or conservation, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, highly customizable for sure.
Wonderful. Now we have three different people who are asking quite similar questions in the chat. And that is David, Garnet, and Claire. And they all want to know, so a lot of folks really rush towards solutions. That's something that we see in a lot of community work. So David asks, how might we invite people who are solution driven to slow down? And Garnet says, a barrier I see to doing this work is our cultural values for solutions. So how do we address that?
Yeah, the book was designed for people who have an action bias. So I mean, this sounds tell them to read the book. But also like and that comes from my co-author, well, both my co-authors went through business school. I didn't. My background's urban planning. And so I'm quite comfortable in a more like my default is a little more analytical, a little more contemplative, slower. Whereas I think the norm in business schools is we need to, we reward things like hackathons and design sprints and case competitions and things like that. We don't really reward um, deep analysis of problem solving, which is different than, say, social science. Like if you're doing a social science degree like philosophy or sociology or anthropology, you might actually be really comfortable with like this may be ridiculously common sense. You might be reading this and go, well, yeah, of course you need to understand the problem. You might be doing a criminology degree and go like, yeah, like, thank you. We know that the correction system doesn't correct people. Thanks for that. Like, no news flash here, right? We know the healthcare system isn't, it's a sick care system. But, but, but so our bias is that we think a lot of the people reading this will actually have that action bias. They will already be predisposed and pre-programmed in a sense and pre-incentivized to producing a rapid solution, a rapid iteration, rapid prototyping, and so on. And so, that's the trickiest audience to work with, and that was always in our sights in writing this. I don't know if we've succeeded in that respect. But I think it's a really brilliant question. It's not an easy answer. I mean, and I don't want to be glib or flippant about just saying, read the book, but truly we did try and include sections that directly address the action bias. And there's even one section that says it's okay if you are completely married to your solution and you just can't let go of it. Or there's too many sunk costs. You've already spent money in your thing. Your app is your life's work. You cannot bear the thought of stepping away from that. We also kind of throw you a bone in a sense and say, well, there may be a market for what you're doing. There may be a context in which your solution actually does work. And so we actually have like stories about that, people who couldn't let go of their solution. But then the question is match where, and like hang up your solution enough, have enough, because it's tricky, right? You're told in your whole journey, if you're doing an entrepreneurial pathway, people say, no matter what the critics say, don't listen to the critics. You must have grit, you must have tenacity, you must be audacious. 99 people will tell you it's a bad idea, but listen to that one person. Stuff like that. And a lot of that's kind of folk wisdom that's not empirically based. But okay, yeah, yes, grit, tenacity, it's important. Um, but it has to be balanced. You cannot interpret that as being willfully blind. So, for example, we have a section on using the landscape section, that landscape tools, to accept the fact a priori that your idea probably has been invented or created by somebody else, somewhere else, in some context already, and probably they're doing it better than you are, and you have to prepare yourself for that. It may not be the case, but it usually is the case. And
There,
that's both in commercial context and social context. And so there's a
I'm
whole like hand-holding process for that.
I'm mindful of. I feel like I'm the clock watcher, and I'm so sorry because I could spend the day here, but there's so many juicy questions showing up, as you can see, both in the chat and in the Q&A now. Um, I think David asks this lovely set of like they're flip sides of the coin questions. One is, what makes a question too powerful to ask, and what happens if you ask it anyway? And his flip side is, are there some questions too dangerous or disruptive to ask, even if they're beautiful? So,
Mm.
love a couple of moments of insight in that. And then there's a couple of other juicy ones I want to make sure we have time for as well.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes. Yes, there are questions that would be so beautiful you would not be able to look at them because it would. I mean, we have a little vignette on Plato's allegory of the cave, where somebody who's exposed to the light and to the real three-dimensional images comes back and tells um, his buddies that only have seen the shadows dancing on the wall and interpret that as reality, that there's this whole other reality out there. And their reaction is violence. Their reaction is they don't want to hear it. That it makes them angry to hear that. And there are many examples in contemporary society, many examples that we can easily brainstorm, where your beautiful question is just a little bit too beautiful, and it might even put you in, you might get canceled, or you might be put in jail, or you might, depending on the context, right? Shouldn't have certain things on your phone if you're entering the US. Those are serious questions, and we also say, there's a related concept is these deep leverage points, changing entire paradigms and the way we think of the real context underlying a given system. And those are powerful if we can change those. But sometimes the reality is they're unavailable to change because the price of changing them um, is 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 so disruptive that the time and the place may not be the right one, or it's done at tremendous self jeopardy or self peril. So it's true that you can be too beautiful, but we do, and then it becomes an ethical question. How much of a beautiful question do you share with the world?
Thank you. That is a great answer. And now we have two more questions. But two of them I think are quite similar. So I'm going to ask you them together, and then we have one more after. We just have about 5 minutes for these two questions. So I'm going to ask Kate's question from the chat and Trey's from the Q&A box together. So Trey is a funder who wants to make systems change. And with funding, sometimes there is specific timelines in which to spend funds. So how do they slow down and ask beautiful questions while doing that? And then Kate is working in the government and one of the only people in a government setting who sees the value of slowing down and asking beautiful questions. So for government employees and for funders, how can they move beyond maybe even work constraints to continue to ask those beautiful questions?
Well, I actually think there's data that can be marshaled around. For example, like I look at some of what looks like rapid solutionizing in a public expenditure or procurement context. I'm thinking, for example, around First Nations water treatment or large public infrastructure projects that could be publicly owned pipelines or new highways or new ships for the military or new subways and LRTs. And we can all think of these examples where they've taken years longer, and the cost has ballooned to unreasonable proportions based on what the initial estimates were. And when you start to dig into the systemic reasons for that, you realize things like there's no chain of accountability that makes sense. There are too many subcontractors that have subcontractors that have subcontractors, and then no one really is accountable at the end of the day for how things are spent, and so on and so forth. If you can marshal enough of these examples that show actually in our quest to deal with this issue really rapidly, we hired McKinsey and we thought they would come up with something really fast and quick. I mean, nothing wrong with McKinsey in one sense, but like we do a lot of that, right? We're like, we don't actually take the time to do the proper analysis to build what's required, if potentially in-house, to implement a project in a reasonable, fair, accountable way. We sometimes just kind of shoot from the hip and run after these what looks like action, but in the end will cost us more money and it will take more time. I mean, I I lived in Toronto for a dozen years up until 2002. I think the Eglinton Crosstown line had already started. It was about 3 years into planning, approvals, and so on. And tell me, does anyone know if it's actually opened yet?
It is not.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, there are a growing number of these examples, and it seems to be a kind of meta-systemic problem that's affecting many different sectors. So when we think about, okay, we're going to spend 5% on defense spending now, um, well, what is that going to look like, and how much is that going to cost, and what are we going to get for it at the end of the day? And are we applying a careful systems understanding lens to that? Or are we just going to be pitched on a bunch of things?
Now we have time
I
for
have one more question, and it's going to be a very fast one because we are quickly running out of time. Thank you, everyone, for the wonderful questions that you've been sending. These are really, and I'm so sorry if we don't get to yours. Now I'm going to blend two more questions together, which is Kirsten's from the chat and Shannon's from the Q&A box. So Kirsten talks about restorative justice teaches that it's critical to spend time getting acquainted and building relationships. So talk a little bit about relationship building, but then Shannon has an interesting point on that relationship building, which is that in small rural communities like Shannon's, sometimes there can be too much reliance on individuals and their own goodwill rather than a system or a process. So how do we create that goodwill and that relationship, but then also how do we make sure that individual people aren't experiencing the brunt of those plans?
Yeah, great question. It speaks to so many things, actually speaks to so many things that are at the heart of Tamarack too, right? Like this dilemma of the whole history of the modern contemporary nonprofit sector and the John McKnight critique of like it being a kind of poor proxy for real community. But at the same time, it's a reasonable question. Like, how much do we burden real community when you're actually, what does that mean? Real caregiving? Like, are we supporting caregivers? Are we supporting informal family caregivers enough? Are we supporting sandwich generation people enough? Like, it's complex, and so yeah, it seems like a sexy answer to say yes, community, or yes, broader system, but it's complex. The other piece of the question, though, is what was the first part of the question? It was.
I think it was about building relationships and how
Yes.
to do
Yeah.
that, but then also
Yeah.
how do we make sure that those individual people aren't
Right.
supported?
Leroy Little Bear, who's a scholar at University of Lethbridge, and I think one of in my view, should be considered among the highest echelons of systems thinking academics in the world, whether he's recognized as such or not. I mean, he is somebody who talks about Blackfoot cosmology, Blackfoot science, as being so deeply rooted in relationship that relationship is the fundamental unit of existence. And he has a very interesting talk. He talked at the most recent Banff System Summit as a keynote, where he said, it's interesting that cutting edge science, physics, quantum physics in particular, is kind of going to the same place of the fundamental nature of reality is a kind of it's not really stuff. It's not stuff with mass. It's not something you can objectively say it's a noun, it's a thing, it's a particle. It's more like energy. It's more like connection. It's more like, and so to see the world as more in a state of flow, in a state of animation, as everything is kind of living or animate, is in many ways a much more accurate way of looking at reality than what we have come to learn in the West as a more deadened, static, linear binary point of view. And the implications of that are incredibly vast and interesting, but relationship is so important and so undervalued and underestimated in our dominant discourse. And that's a big mistake.
Thank you,
Wonderful.
James. This has been incredible. We're at 2 minutes to the hour, if you can believe it. So on behalf of all of us, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to bring this incredible resource to life. And now I'm going to turn it over to you, Marie, to bring us home.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sylvia. And thank you, James, for your wonderful insights and for speed running those wonderful questions, those beautiful questions, one might say. Just a couple quick points before we wrap things up. Sylvia will be running a workshop upcoming in September. There are 2 dates, September 18th and 25th. So it's a 2-part workshop. I was sharing the link to that in the chat if you'd like to join. And I'll also be sharing the link to our general learning calendar. If you're interested in joining other workshops, other webinars, we have all of that available. So please check that out. And Sylvia, any final words before we end off today?
Well, just a great big thank you. And also a heads up to watch your email, because in the next few days, you will get a copy of this webinar that you can access along with the ideas and links that were shared in the chat here. So we can continue to stay connected with you and help you stay connected to this lovely conversation. Thanks, everyone. Have a fantastic afternoon. James, Mairead, thank you so much. This has been lovely. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.